What if the Soviet Union didn't really lose the Cold War on the battlefield? What if it didn't even lose it because of ideology? What if the decisive blow came from something far more mundane? Oil prices. For decades we've been told a simple story. Communism failed, the Soviet economy stagnated, and the system collapsed under its own weight. That story is comforting. It suggests history was inevitable, but here's the uncomfortable question few people ask. Why did the Soviet Union survive for 70 years industrializing, winning World War II, becoming a nuclear superpower, and then suddenly collapse in just a few years? Systems don't usually fail overnight. They are pushed, and in the early 1980s, the Soviet economy was pushed deliberately by an economic weapon more powerful than missiles or armies. A quiet alliance, a flood of oil, a price collapse. This is the story of how the United States and Saudi Arabia turned energy markets into a weapon, and how that weapon helped bankrupt the Soviet Union from the inside. To understand how the collapse happened, we need to understand what actually powered the Soviet economy. By the 1970s, the USSR was not surviving on ideology alone. It was surviving on exports, especially oil and gas. After massive oil discoveries in Siberia, the Soviet Union became one of the world's largest energy producers. By the late 1970s, oil and gas made up over half of Soviet hard currency exports. Energy sales funded grain imports, consumer goods, and technology from the West. Oil revenues papered over deep inefficiencies and central planning. This created a dangerous illusion. The Soviet system looked stable, but it was increasingly addicted to oil income priced in US dollars, and that meant the USSR was no longer insulated from global markets. It was exposed. At the same time, the Cold War had entered a new phase. The US had learned something critical from Vietnam and previous confrontations. Direct military conflict with the USSR was too risky, so the battlefield shifted from tanks to finance, trade, and energy. Ironically, oil once saved the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, the world experienced two massive oil shocks in 1973 and 1979. Prices skyrocketed. For oil exporters, this was a windfall. For the USSR, it was a lifeline. As oil prices surged, Soviet export revenues exploded. The government could afford massive military spending. Consumer shortages were masked by imports. Economic stagnation was postponed, not solved. But this created a fatal dependency. Instead of reforming the system, Soviet leaders relied on oil money to maintain the status quo. Meanwhile, the United States was paying close attention. American strategists noticed something critical. The Soviet Union needed high oil prices to survive, and if oil prices collapsed, so would Soviet revenues. By the early 1980s, the US economy had its own crisis: inflation, unemployment, and the aftershocks of oil dependence. Then came Ronald Reagan. Reagan's administration believed the Soviet Union was economically weaker than it appeared. The goal was not coexistence, it was pressure. The strategy had three parts. 1. Military spending pressure. Force the USSR to match US defense spending it couldn't afford. 2. Technology and credit restrictions cut Soviet access to Western finance and advanced equipment. 3. Energy price manipulation hit the USSR where it was most vulnerable: oil revenue. This third element required a partner with enormous influence over oil markets. That partner was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia controlled massive spare production capacity, the ability to flood the market with oil and crash prices, and it was a close US ally. Behind closed doors, Washington encouraged Riyadh to increase oil production, even if it hurt short-term Saudi revenues, to achieve a strategic goal. The result was one of the most dramatic oil price collapses in history. In the mid-1980s, Saudi Arabia opened the taps. Oil flooded global markets. Prices collapsed from over $30 per barrel to below $10 in real terms. For oil importing countries, this was a relief. For oil exporters like the Soviet Union, it was catastrophic. Soviet hard currency earnings plummeted almost overnight, and the consequences were brutal. Foreign reserves drained rapidly, grain imports became harder to finance. Consumer goods disappeared from shelves, budget deficits exploded. The ruble, though officially fixed, was effectively worthless internationally. The Soviet state was suddenly short of dollars. The currency needed to function in the global economy, and unlike capitalist systems, it couldn't adapt quickly. Prices were fixed, production targets were rigid, information flowed slowly. By the time leaders understood the scale of the damage, it was already too late. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. Often portrayed as the man who ended the Cold War, Gorbachev inherited a system already bleeding out. His reforms, perestroika and glasnost, were attempts to save socialism, not destroy it. But here's the problem. Economic reform requires capital, stability, and time. The Soviet Union had none of those. Oil revenues were collapsing, debt was rising, confidence was evaporating. Partial reforms made things worse. Central planning was weakened, but markets weren't fully established. State control loosened, but incentives remained broken. Political openness exposed economic failures to the public instead of recovery. The economy entered a death spiral. Shortages worsened, inflation surged, republics began to break away. The oil weapon had done its work. By 1991, the Soviet Union was finished, not defeated militarily, not invaded, not bombed. It collapsed under economic pressure. The state could no longer pay its bills, feed its population, reliably hold its republics together, maintain legitimacy. Oil revenues never recovered in time. The final irony, the collapse was widely celebrated as an ideological victory. Capitalism over communism, while the economic mechanics were largely ignored. But history is rarely that simple. This was not just a system failing naturally. It was a system pushed past its breaking point. Here's where this story stops being history and starts being a warning. Today, energy remains a geopolitical weapon. Sanctions replace bombs. Financial systems are weaponized. Dollar access determines survival. We've seen similar strategies used against Iran, Venezuela, Russia, other resource-dependent states. The pattern is clear. 1. Identify a dependency. 2. Control the pricing or access. 3. Apply sustained pressure. 4. Wait for internal collapse. And it's not just states. Entire economies today depend on cheap credit, stable commodity prices, continuous capital flows. When those assumptions break, collapse can happen fast, just like it did for the Soviet Union. Takeaway number 1. Empires collapse economically before they collapse politically. The Soviet Union fell long before the flag was lowered. The collapse was already locked in once oil revenues disappeared. Takeaway number 2. Markets can be more powerful than militaries. No invasion was needed. Oil prices achieved what armies could not. Takeaway number 3. Dependency is a hidden weakness. Any system that relies on one revenue stream, oil, debt, technology, or finance, is vulnerable to pressure. The fall of the Soviet Union wasn't inevitable. It was engineered through pressure, timing, and leverage. And that should make us uncomfortable, because the same tools are still being used today, quietly, legally, and effectively. The question isn't whether economic warfare works. The question is, who is vulnerable next? If you want more deep, serious stories about money, power, and how empires really fall, like, subscribe, and share this video. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And the rhyme is getting louder.